And I think it's nice that we're sort of getting back to composers as being, yes, we're important and we have interesting ideas, but we're also in service to music as an art form. And we're trying to help music along and make it something that's vibrant and part of people's lives.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Everything Band, a podcast that features conversations with composers, conductors, and performers of music for winds and percussion. My name is Mark Connor. I'm a composer and educator, and each week I have the good fortune to speak with and share the stories and wisdom of musicians and leaders in the band community. Are you planning to travel with your group sometime soon? If so, please consider my sponsor, Kaleidoscope Adventures, a full-service tour company specializing in student group travel. With a former educator as its CEO, Kaleidoscope Adventures is dedicated to changing student lives through travel, and they offer high-quality service and an attention to detail that comes from more than 25 years of student travel experience. Trust Kaleidoscope's outstanding staff to focus on your group's one-of-a-kind adventure so that you can focus on everything else. The Everything Band podcast is a proud member of the Music Teachers Development Podcast Network. The Muted Network provides support in the form of audio-on-demand programming designed by and for music educators. You can find more information about our network at mutedpodcasts.com. Before we begin, I'd like to thank all of you for listening. I appreciate your time and hope that you are finding value from these interviews. I rely on word of mouth and social media to bring the show to new listeners. If you think you knew one or two people who might find these interviews useful, please let them know about it. You can also help by following me and sharing posts on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Remember, help your students live up to the best that is in them through music. And now, on to my next guest, James M. David. Hi, Jim.
Hi, Mark. How are you?
I'm doing really well. Thanks for joining me.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So, Jim, I'm going to let you introduce yourself to the listeners, and then I'm going to talk about the connection that you and I have. So why don't you go ahead and tell the listeners who you are and what you do?
Okay, so I'm Jim David. Professionally, I go by James M. David to hopefully avoid confusion as to my first name and my last name. Happens to me all the time. And I'm a professional composer, and I also teach music theory and composition at Colorado State University here in Fort Collins, Colorado, which is where I live. We're about an hour north of Denver, about an hour east of Rocky Mountain National Park. And it's just an absolutely fantastic job that I have here. I tell people all the time, this is my favorite job I've ever had. I just get to make music and help my students make better music. So it's a really fantastic fit. And I've been here about 11 years now, so it's been a great time.
Yeah, so for my listeners, Jim and I were actually doctoral students at Florida State as composers in the early 2000s together. We were in the same studio. I think that we have some other connections through there that may come out over the course of the interview, but just for full disclosure.
I think we even shared an office at one point. So.
All right, Jim. So can you tell the listeners your origin story? How did you get started into music? What instrument do you play, etc.?
Okay, so I was born and raised in a small town in South Georgia called Cairo, Georgia, which is a little bit north of Tallahassee, actually, where Florida State is located. And both my parents were musicians and also educators. They actually met in the jazz band at Georgia Southern College. My dad's a drummer and my mom was a trumpet player. And my dad was my high school band director. He taught for over 40 years at all different levels. And my mom was a elementary music teacher and also taught private piano lessons. So as I tell people all the time, I've been in band essentially my entire life and love it still to this day. And I grew up with jazz and classical kind of in equal measures. Both my brothers are actually professional jazz musicians and also teach college music at that level. And so you have that sort of competitive thing there with your brothers. So I wanted to be good at jazz as well as everything else that I was trying to do. And so I took some piano in high school, which was really helpful as a composer, and kind of grew up in the Southern Baptist Church. And there I kind of learned a lot about that traditional hymn repertoire for Southern gospel music. And my piano teacher is also the organist there. So he kind of helped me understand how to play in that style. So that's another kind of big part of my musical DNA there. As far as starting out, I played trombone in the 6th grade. My dad, he was a trombonist, and he had not gotten a trombonist yet in the family, so I was pretty much forced to play the trombone, and also kind of started composing around about the same time. I just really liked the idea of trying to make symbols into music. That was something really fascinating to me, that was how music worked. And so I ended up actually writing a couple little terrible things for my middle school band, and my middle school band director was nice enough to actually allow me to have them played by the bands. And so that kind of got the bug started there. I kept going throughout high school, and pursued trombone pretty seriously throughout high school, and decided I wanted to study that at the sort of undergrad level. And I ended up going to the University of Georgia and studied composition initially, but then ended up finally settling on music education for my undergraduate degree. I studied composition the whole time, but decided to get the degree in music education, not entirely certain where my future career was going to land, as I think happens to a lot of people. And that was a great musical experience there. But another thing I really loved about my time at Georgia was the honors program, which I got to take all of my liberal arts classes with tenured professors in really small classrooms, and it really helped me sort of love the literature and visual art, and just the general sort of being informed about the culture and taking it seriously. And that's something that really still informs most of the music that I write even today. And other things that I did while I was at Georgia, I got to study with Sammy Nestico, which I'm sure a lot of your listeners know that name, great jazz composer and arranger. And I studied with him for a couple of years at Georgia, and I take a lot of things away from him all the time. His origin story is one that I really like, that his first piece he wrote was a big band arrangement, and he passed it out to the players, and they couldn't read their parts because he wrote all of them in bass clef, because he's a trombone player and didn't know there was another clef. So it's great to hear somebody like that starting at such a sort of low level there, and then going on to do so many amazing things. So I had a great time there. And ultimately, I did some student teaching and some private teaching for a while there, but really loved composition so much, and I decided to go back for grad school, and ended up at Florida State, which, as you know, has a great reputation for music theory. And I was hoping to get a teaching job out of doing that. And I had a great time working with both the students and the faculty there, particularly my main professor, Ladislav Kubik, and also Rick Clary, who's the senior wind conductor there, who was my conducting teacher. And I also played in his band there. So he's been a great influence on me as well. And so, and that's basically the whole story. I still went back to teaching public school for a couple years after finishing my doctorate. I was also teaching adjunct for 2 or 3 years there as well, before getting my current position. So, that's sort of the rest is history from that.
All right, Jim, there's a lot there to untangle here as I kind of think about your story and listen to what you're telling me. So after you finished your doctorate at Florida State, you mentioned that you went and taught public schools. Can you tell me about that experience?
Yeah. So, the challenge of getting a full-time academic job is pretty tough. And I think for composition, it's actually particularly tough. And so having that, teaching certificate, I was like, well, this is a good way to make a decent living and stay active in the field of music. So I went back and did that. It was actually at a small town in Georgia, just south of Atlanta. And I was teaching grades 3 through 5, elementary music, and also teaching choir there as well. So that choir training in church actually came back, and playing piano, all that was definitely helpful to me. So,
And so, what was that job like? I mean, you had a doctorate in composition. You were obviously applying to full-time composition jobs while you were teaching third graders through fifth graders. What was that job like? How did that help prepare you for what you're doing now?
Well, it prepared me in a lot of ways, really. I mean, certainly it improved my classroom teaching and gave me a lot of ability to organize my thoughts and create coherent lesson plans. And that's something that I think is a tremendous advantage teaching in the classroom environment now for me. And it gave me a lot of focus as to what I really wanted to do long term. Applying for jobs, that's a very time consuming process on its own. So that was challenging to do that while also starting a new position there. So it was definitely a tough time for me, but I really value that time. I was also teaching adjunct composition and theory at Columbus State University at the same time. So that was an even tougher sort of balance there to try to teach 2 or 3 courses each semester in addition to a full-time teaching job.
All right. And so then you did land the job at Colorado State, and that's where we pick up kind of your current story, right?
Yes.
All right. And so let's talk about your principal thing, other than being a theory teacher and a composition teacher there. Your primary engagement with the band field is that you're a composer and you're having a lot of success writing for band at the moment.
Yes, I've really enjoyed doing that for the past, it's been actually 15 years now that I've been writing for band, but I got really serious in about the past 5 years or so.
So, Jim, can you tell everyone what kind of things are you writing now? What kinds of recent successes have you had in the field? What's just to give everyone sort of a frame of reference for what you're doing?
Sure. So I write mostly at the sort of college level or advanced high school level. And, I've had some good successes with some of those types of pieces. One that has been played a good bit recently is a piece called Ghost of the Old Year. It's about a 16-minute piece, and it just got recorded by the North Texas Wind Symphony with Eugene Corporon, and that was a really amazing experience working with that ensemble. I had a piece called With Soul Serene, which is about a grade 3.5, 4 sort of piece that won the National Band Association Wingert Jones Award. And that piece was just played at Midwest, actually, by Vandercook College of Music. And that piece is kind of one of my first ones that I felt I really cracked that grade level. I felt pretty good that it turned out the way that I wanted it to and still fit that grade level. I'm kind of working my way down slowly to get better at writing for younger band. I think that's a really big challenge to write effective music for younger grade levels.
So let me ask you a couple questions, Jim, about becoming a composer and sort of your influences, if that's okay with you.
Sure, absolutely.
And first of all, I don't want to talk about stylistic first. I want to talk about the influence of that middle school band director who played your music, and you characterize it as bad. I mean, I don't think any of us at 12 are writing great music. But,
right.
But what sort of lasting impression, what lasting impact on your career did that have? And what can we say to middle school band directors who might have a kid who's writing music in their group?
Right. I think the biggest thing for me was just realizing that it was possible. I literally wrote that piece in a notebook, that I picked up at an office supply store, and then just handed it to my band director, and then copied out all the parts by hand. And there we go. We read the piece, and it just happened. And just the fact that was even physically possible to me was completely mind blowing at the time. And so it just, I had the bug at that point. I just wanted to try other things, no matter how frustrating it might be to put all the effort into that. It was really, really fascinating. So I'd encourage any teacher at that level, if they have a student that's interested in composing, just to give them even just a few minutes of time to actually physically hear their music. There's no substitute for that. And that's the best way that we learn as composers, even as we do it, on down into college and even beyond that. There's no substitute for hearing your music performed. There's nothing more exciting than hearing your music performed for the first time. So yeah, any opportunity for you to give that to a student is a very, very special thing.
Mm-hmm. You also mentioned jazz and gospel in your background. How much do you think that plays in your composition?
It depends on the piece. Some pieces have a really obvious kind of overt jazz style in there. I wrote a piece called Big Four on the River, which has several different sort of jazz influences in there. It's the Big Four is kind of a reference to New Orleans second line music, where you sort of put the emphasis on the fourth beat, and that kind of takes you through different eras of jazz. There has a little bit of a swing influence, a little bit of a bebop, even into like fusion sort of sound in there. I wrote a clarinet concerto called Auto 66 that has a really obvious relationship to Benny Goodman and Artie Shaw, that sort of era of jazz, and that kind of thing comes out in different pieces. And just the way that I tend to voice chords, the certain types of harmonies I really love, that beautiful sort of blending of jazz and impressionism that you might get with, say, a McCoy Tyner or Bill Evans, somebody like that. That definitely comes in a lot of my music. And I like seeing those connections between, say, impressionist composers like, say, Debussy or Ravel with American composers. And that's something that I just love, is to sort of embrace a lot of different influences. I'm a kind of postmodernist at heart. I love to have as many different things in the pot as I can. That's something that just gets my creative juices flowing every single time. So
from your position as a composition teacher at a university, are there anything that we can do in the band classroom, in the choir classroom, in the music classroom, to sort of help students realize their writing aspirations or their compositional aspirations?
Sure. I think, talking to composers, if you're working with a living composer, taking the time to talk to them, even for a few minutes, would be a great thing, just so that a student could see that this is a person that's doing this and what their sort of background is. That's one of my favorite things to do, is to actually go and work with student ensembles and just be able to have that sort of face-to-face interaction with them. That's a huge thing. And, with modern technology, it makes it a lot easier to do that with, video conferencing and that sort of thing. And again, just sort of exposing students to as much repertoire as you can, taking time and treating listening as like a valuable skill. Just listening to music on its own is something that I think composers really have to develop, and have a special way of critically listening to music. And I think you can develop that at a very young age, and that will help them throughout the rest of their careers, regardless of what they end up doing with music. That's, I think, something that can be very, very helpful to them.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have any other advice that you'd give to young composers?
Sure. I mean, this is kind of my passion, in my teaching is teaching private composition, and I have a lot of thoughts there. I think the first one would be to really internalize the music that you love the most, to take the time to really make that a part of your, as I kind of mentioned earlier, sort of your musical DNA, spending time with the scores, listening as much as possible, understanding the sort of individual influences of the people that made that music, and sort of seeing how they compared to their colleagues from their time, and people that were sort of their historical precedents. All of that is really, really important. And just, with modern technology and streaming services, there's that tendency to listen to music at arm's length, kind of browsing, just leaving things on in the background. That's something that you have to avoid as a composer. You have to really seriously spend time with that music and just making it a part of you. I think the next big one for me that I slowly figured out over time was really understanding each individual medium that you're writing for every time, and really thinking about the physicality of the instruments that you're writing for. Certain things are going to sound really great on clarinet and are going to sound really terrible on violin. And, the more you sort of have that sort of physicality to each individual instrument or ensemble that you're talking about, the better you'll be able to write for them, and the better they're going to be able to express your ideas, because ultimately that's what you're trying to do is communicate an idea to the listeners and to the performers as best as you possibly can. And so if you're working against the physicality of something, that can be, really a huge impediment to making that work well, for you expressing yourself. The next big thing for me, and this is one that is the hardest, I think, to embrace as a young person, is just to be patient. I think composing is the slowest career in music. It takes just a long time just to produce enough music that people can then discover you and have the ability to understand who you are as a musician. I spoke to Jim Stevenson recently, who I'm sure a lot of your listeners know is. He's written a lot of brass music, and I was like, wow, he's so well known writing music for trumpet. And I was writing a trumpet sonata at the time. I was like, I'll just go look at what he's done. Well, he's written something like 25 solo pieces for trumpet, and it's just like, well, there you go. That's why he's so well known. He just has such an amazing catalog of music to then draw from. And that doesn't come overnight. You have to really spend a lot of time fostering that. So having that patience is really essential to that. The next big thing I think for younger composers is to think about developing your ear in multiple different ways, not just focusing on pitch. Not that pitch is not important, obviously, but thinking about rhythm, thinking about texture, timbre, your form, just the sort of general. Not form just in the sort of academic sense, but also how the sort of energy from one section of a piece of music moves into the energy to another section. All of that is something that is not generally taught in a typical oral skills type class in college, and you have to start thinking about that anytime you're doing that, because you as a composer, you have to process all of those things. And I think in particular, the one that we spend the least amount of time on is timbre and orchestration, developing your ear towards that, because I think a lot of the greatest composers, they will have that in common, regardless of what their stylistic things are, maybe in terms of harmony or form or melody. They will all have a ability to create compelling and colorful sounds with the timbre and texture and orchestration. So I think it's really important to not neglect that in developing your ear. The next big one for composers to me is what I call the loop that you want to have as a composer, is starting by listening and looking at scores and really, like I said, internalizing that music first, then writing for something. And if you're writing for a specific medium, you're going to start by looking and listening to music in that medium, and then writing something for that, then having that piece performed. And then that gives you a chance to then evaluate how well you achieved some of the things that you were trying to do. And then just cycling through that, going back to listening and then writing and then evaluating with the performance of a piece, just doing that, finding ways to keep that loop going with every single piece that you write. I think the worst thing you can do as a composer is write a piece and then just put it on a shelf and never think about it again. Try to get it performed in some way, sort of evaluate it, and then you can sort of move on from there. The piece isn't done until it's been performed. And then the last big one to me is to sort of identify your audiences that you're most interested in composing for. And I think when I talk about audiences, I'm not really talking about the listeners, because I think the people who are really consuming your music are, one, performers, and two, are going to be conductors. And you need to understand that there's a different culture with each sort of individual's instruments and ensembles there. Band conductors are not the same as choir conductors and not the same as orchestra conductors. And, if you write a great piece for, say, clarinet, that's awesome. And then clarinetists might have a chance to discover you, but flutists are probably not going to know you. They have the sort of their each individual little place where they learn about their own music, and they rarely talk to people on other instruments that much. So you have to sort of think about that and try to find the ones that you're most interested in and communicate with those people. And I think one of the best ways to do that is to attend conferences for those individual instruments or ensembles that I'm talking about here. Events like, say, the Midwest Conference or, say, maybe a International Clarinet Fest or something like that, where you have a chance to interact with a whole lot of people that you never would otherwise. And again, it's just a chance to meet those individual audiences that will hopefully want to consume your music.
Yeah, Jim, this is a lot of terrific advice. So if someone out there is listening who has a student who might want to pursue composition, this would be something definitely to steer them to listen to. This is really great. These are things that we learn over the course of time being composers that you just sort of distilled.
Yeah, and a lot of it you don't necessarily learn in college because there's just not time to cover this. You have to cover a lot of the more, basics of music literacy. And so yeah, a lot of the sort of more professional side of things, you learn that over years and years of doing it and just trying to discover your own path with that. That's a real challenge, I think, for composers. Is there isn't a set path. There's not one way of being a professional composer, and I think everybody has their own unique skill set and their own unique networks that they then have to access to hopefully build on their career.
Hey there, everyone. My name is Anne Molesky, and I'm the host of the Anna Krusik Podcast, another podcast in the Muted Network. It's my mission to help music teachers be more purposeful, sequential, and joyful in each and everything they do as teacher-musicians. Join me every Thursday as I share tips, tricks, and meaningful conversations with other music teachers about how to make the general music classroom more intentional and impactful for both you and your students.
So, you studied with Sammy Nestico?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What was he like?
He was amazing. Yeah. He had such an incredible knowledge of what to do in almost any situation, because he had written for literally anything you could think of, and he would pull out these scores of well, this is a Budweiser ad I did in 1973, and it's written for strings and 3 bass flutes and rhythm section. It's just oh my God, it's so bizarre to sort of see why they would want a particular thing in a particular commission or something like that. He was amazing. Had really, really straightforward, simple ways of teaching how to do voicing and stuff like that. Yeah, it's really good. His arranging textbook is really fantastic.
I know he's still alive. How's he doing? Do you know?
I know he's still alive, and he's still more or less active, as much as you can be at that age. But yeah, I don't know. And he still actually had something relatively recently came out on some sort of album or something.
Yeah, God, what a legend. That would be someone I'd love to have on this show. Oh my God.
Oh yeah, he's great, and he's super easy to talk to. Yeah, he's amazing.
We've talked about a lot on the show the value of having composers with students, and so what does it look like if someone wanted to have you write a piece for their group?
Sure. So typically, when somebody approaches me about writing something, I want to know the basic details as quickly as I can, and as much detail as I can determine from them. Obviously, timeline, when they need it, and that's the biggest one. And that, at this stage, I'm looking at least a year out and that sort of thing. The length of the piece is going to be a big one. The grade level, obviously, I need to know that as specifically as I can. I usually they'll say something, well, we can do a grade 5 but mostly we do grade 4. Yeah, I'm going to try to shoot more towards grade 4 in that sort of situation. And any sort of special instrumentation things I might need to think about, especially if it's written for a specific group, who are your strongest soloists maybe within the band, whether you're a particularly strong or weaker section that I might want to consider, auxiliary instruments, things like piano or harp or something like that, I might want to think about. Is there a particular programmatic thing I might need to worry about? Is the piece in memory of someone, or maybe it's a celebratory or anniversary type piece, and so you want a particular sort of character to kind of go along with that? So those are the first things that I want to kind of establish. And once I know that, then it's pretty easy for me to then just sort of go off from there. And, with a fee, I'll usually just sort of say, well, this is what I'm typically paid for something like this. And then you can give me a counteroffer sometimes. I'm usually open sometimes if there's some other type of compensation possible. Say if you performed a piece at a major conference, or you promise to have a certain number of performances of the piece, because sometimes the royalties from that will actually be greater than what a commission might be. And so that can be really helpful, especially if you're dealing with, I've done this several times with kind of smaller pieces, more like chamber pieces, where you don't really want to charge people something, many thousands of dollars when it's just one person paying for a piece like that. So it can be really helpful to have an alternate form of compensation for something there. The other kind of commission that I do a lot of is consortium commissions, which I think is really common in the band world. I wish it were more common actually with other mediums too, but I think that it's really great because it's helpful to both composers and to the ensembles. It saves money for the ensembles, and then the composer gets more performances and more exposure out of the piece. And I think you can also give a little more creative freedom to the composer too, because you kind of tell them what sort of piece you're interested in writing, and then they can sort of decide if that's something that would work for their particular needs. And I think that can be really a successful thing for me there. And sometimes that's like I have a performer or conductor that I want to work with, and they might not have enough money to pay for a piece just by itself, but then they can kind of get a network of their friends together and help make that piece a reality. So that's a really great thing. And then that can continue to build those relationships with performers and conductors over time. And that's the thing that I think, is so essential for composers is creating those relationships. And I think consortiums are a really, really great way to do that. I'm a big fan of doing that. I've actually done a lot of this now with chamber music and solo music as well. I started out just doing it with band music, but now I've really tried to adopt that as often as I can with other mediums as well. It's kind of like I talked about earlier with the attending conferences. It's just another way to sort of build that network and identifying those specific groups of musicians that might be interested in performing your music or commissioning a piece from you.
Yeah, absolutely. So how about your music if people wanted to get it? Are you self-published? Are you commercially published? How do you handle your music?
So I kind of have a sort of hybrid thing here. I don't know if it was intentional. It just kind of worked out this way. Most of my band music is distributed by Murphy Music Press, which is, I think, a really great compromise between the sort of, traditional commercial publishing and self-publishing. For people who aren't familiar with them, they handle the printing and shipping costs, and they will also work with retailers like, say, J.W. Pepper or somebody like them. But I will retain my publisher royalties, and I also retain a larger cut of each individual sale compared to like a traditional publisher. And I think that's particularly good for sort of higher grade level pieces, because those tend to be, you sell less of those, but at a higher cost of those particular kinds of pieces. So I think it's a really good model there. I have one band piece that I mentioned earlier called With Soul Serene. And because it won that contest, the National Band Association contest, it's actually now published by Wingert Jones Publications, which is one of the bigger middle school band publishers out there. They do other stuff as well, but I think that's their sort of core market there. And so it's listed as a grade 3. And, with a grade 3 piece, royalties aren't a big concern because you don't get royalties on performances at high schools and middle schools. And so it's not a big deal there. Plus, your margins are lower because the price of each set is going to be less than what you'd have for a college level piece. So I think for that grade level, I'm hoping that's a better fit there, at least right now. That piece just came out. It was just available for the first time in December. So it's going to be interesting to sort of see how that plays out compared to my stuff that I have with Murphy Music. So yeah. And then I have some smaller pieces, solo and chamber pieces that are published by kind of specialty people that are interested in very specific markets. Like I have some of my percussion music published by Messiaen Publications, and that's kind of what I think they're sort of best known for is their percussion catalog there. And I have some clarinet saxophone pieces published, like again with specialty smaller publishers that only work with those specific demographics. And so those kinds of people, they'll go to all of the major conferences and be selling their stuff directly to those particular instruments. And I think that's a good fit there too. Same kind of deal. There's not a huge margin on chamber music or solo music. So you want really to sort of make up with that with volume. So yeah, I think self-publishing is great if you're, again, because you retain royalties and you get that larger percentage of each sale. And again, it works with certain kinds of music. Not as the disadvantage there, I think, is with sort of when you need high volume and lower margin type music. So yeah, I really think it depends on the individual composer and what kinds of music they're most interested in writing. I think the thing too is like just time. Just how much time do you want to put into marketing yourself and dealing with all of the, distribution, printing, and all of that sort of thing? That can be a huge headache, and I don't know. It's something that I think every composer has to figure that out for themselves as to what's the best fit for them.
Hello, my name is Bryce Adams. I teach band at North Kitsap High School in Paulsbo, Washington. I'm commissioning Garrett Hope to compose a 4-movement suite for grade 3 band. Garrett Hope's music is exciting, it's accessible, the kids love it, it's fun to play. This piece will be inspired by the 4 winds from Greek mythology, each one having different character and style. The music will be delivered on November 1st, 2020. The first movement, Boreas, is already written, published, and available. I invite you to join a consortium with me to help bring this music to life. The best benefit to joining this consortium is the amazing deal. The buy-in for this project is only $250. You will receive the music for all 4 movements, totaling about 16 minutes worth of music. I would invite everyone to join a consortium. Supporting new music by living composers is what keeps our art alive. Garrett and I will both be at Midwest this year if you'd like to talk about this opportunity. You can find us at the TPC Collective booth. To join this consortium, go to garretthope.com/wins. That's wins with an S.
All right, Jim, this has been a really interesting conversation. So let's talk about the questions I ask of all my guests, kind of about the state of music and music education. And so based on your career experiences, where do you draw the line between healthy and unhealthy competition in music?
Okay, so this is a really great question, and I think it's really difficult to answer perfectly. But to me, if I'm going to give a broad idea, anytime the music is less important than the people or the competition itself, then it's getting to be unhealthy to me. And I think that's something that it's just the music is so important to me, far more important than me being a composer or being known as a composer is just the fact that the music is such an amazing art form and that we should be doing the things that make music better, so competition, if it makes you a better musician, if it makes you, want to be more involved with music, great. But if it's making you just focus on the competition itself, then I think it's going to start to work against you there. Competition for composers, I think, is a little different than it is for performers or for educators. It's very anonymous. You just send your music out there and then you get the almost inevitable rejection letter back and you get no feedback as to why it got rejected. It's just, there you go, it's done. So it's a very negative sort of process, and it's easy to just obsess about that as a composer. So I feel like, most of the time it feels pretty unhealthy to me, or unhelpful at least. I think when I think about this kind of stuff, I try to just avoid comparing myself to what other people are doing and their successes in their own careers, because you can't really hope to reproduce that. Every individual person is going to have such a unique way of arriving at where they are in their particular field that you can't hope to really duplicate that, and so I just really try to avoid those kinds of comparisons as much as possible. And the last one to me, there's try to avoid commoditizing your music, in the sense of trying to work so hard to meet the expectations of other people that you're then going to compromise your own individual voice as a composer, because that's your most sacred, your most valuable asset is your individual voice, because hopefully as you do it long enough, that will just naturally come out, But if you're always trying to make someone else happy and not yourself happy, then you're going to ultimately not be able to be as certain as to what that voice actually is. So that's at least my take on it, and specific to sort of composers, that's how I take on it. The only thing I'd say, again, I'm not a full-time band teacher, but my dad was for many years, and he always said that students and parents, they will adopt the values of the teacher. So if the teacher thinks that competition is more important than music, the students are going to think that too, So, but if the teacher thinks music is the main thing, is the thing that the students should be doing all the time, is making better music, then they will naturally want to do that too.
All right, Jim. So this is a question a lot of musicians, not only band directors, but particularly band directors, struggle with: is how do you achieve a work-life balance?
Well, I showed these questions to my wife beforehand, and she said that she should be the one that answers this question, not me. So there's that. And I said my answer would basically be not very well. But if I'm going to give a somewhat serious answer, I guess I would say I try to schedule some breaks with my writing so that I'm not too focused on something. And I also try to break it up between sort of larger, more intensive kind of projects with smaller things to sort of keep myself fresh with that. A lot of people say that you should compose absolutely every single day. And I do think while I'm writing a piece, I am working on it every single day for an extended period of time. But I do like to have at least a few days in between just to sort of reset everything and feel like I'm able to sort of think again. And plus to sort of maybe forget a little bit about that piece that I've been working on for such a long time. But the other big one for me is just keeping my interests alive outside of music. I said earlier, I love the sort of liberal arts, approach to education, and I try to keep those interests really strong. I still love reading and poetry and all the other visual arts and architecture. I really try to keep that in my life as much as I can, and spend some time with that every day, so that I am able to then have a resource to draw in for my music. So that another sort of source of inspiration there. So that's the best I can give. Other than generally I'm pretty bad at the whole work life thing.
All right, Jim, this is a huge question, which leads people to answer it kind of the best way they can. And what are the challenges facing music education or band, and how can we best meet them?
Yeah, I think to me, the biggest one is managing time correctly, managing students' time, that we're making the most of our time for their students, and then also managing your time as a teacher. Are you doing the kinds of things that will then definitely lead to the best outcome for our students? A big thing for me is are my students doing the activities that are going to give them the maximum benefit for their future careers as musicians? And of course, dealing with all the distractions that exist. I think this is particularly problematic for high school and middle school sort of age, or at least it seems to be. And can you make music important enough that students are going to choose it over these other possible distractions that they have? If there's a goal that I think music education should have in general, is to make every student a lifetime lover of music, regardless of what they end up doing, whether they're doing music as a career or just something that's a part of their life. But making sure that music is something that they want to have in their lives, at some sort of level, and so that it's something that's important to them, and they understand how it can enhance their lives.
All right, Jim, so if I could give you a time machine and set the dial to the day of your high school graduation, what advice would you give yourself?
I would say the biggest one is that I should spend more time talking to people about the things that are interesting and inspiring to me. For one, I think that music, is something that we have to sort of communicate with each other to really understand well. I think a lot of composers tend to be sort of introverted by sort of naturally. I know I personally tend to be more introverted. And as a result of that, you often tend to kind of internalize your own shortcomings as a musician or whatever else, But I've found the more I talk to other musicians and composers in particular, it really helps me calm a lot of those fears and doubts that I might have and realize that we all sort of deal with the same kinds of issues. And for many, many years, really all the way through, even through grad school, I just felt like I was just kind of this island trying to somehow figure this stuff out. And I just wish I had taken more time to talk to other people and understand that, we all have similar thoughts and we can, benefit from working those things out. So that's the biggest one.
All right, Jim, if you could plan it out, what would be the final work that you'd like to conduct or hear or perform?
Okay, so this one, I know you always ask this question, and this is the one I spent definitely the longest thinking about. So I'm going to cheat and have three answers. The one that came to mind first that I felt the strongest about was Messiaen Quartet for the End of Time. I think that piece has so many incredible things in it. It's such an incredible technical achievement, but also such an extraordinarily beautiful piece of music that just moves me every single time I listen to it. I've never, ever gotten tired of it. It's just such an amazing work. But then I was like, well, I want to say something too, because I do love band music so much, and I want to acknowledge how important band music has been to me over the years. And there's so many that kind of came to mind, but the one that kept coming back was Howard Hansen's Chorale and Alleluia. That is still probably my all-time favorite piece for band. I just love how the form sort of develops, how beautifully it's scored. I think that opening brass chorale is just one of the most gorgeous things ever composed for band. It's just so magnificent, and the feeling that you're left with is so energetic and joyous. It's such a fantastic piece. It's one that I've actually never played, but my dad's high school band played it when I was in the 8th grade. And I heard them rehearse it over and over and over again. It just became just such a huge part of my childhood that I just absolutely adore that piece. But when I finally, after spending many hours thinking about it, the one that was the ultimate winner was Copland's Appalachian Spring. And particularly the orchestra version of that piece. I think Copland is such an incredible person. His decision to pursue the kind of music that he ended up pursuing is fascinating throughout his whole career. Such an incredible musician and thinker about music. But that piece in particular is I love every moment of it. I feel like if you changed anything about it, it would be lesser somehow. The orchestration is so precise and clear. It just enhances every idea in it. And I think it's the very last thing I've heard, that final chord, that major 7 chord is so incredibly beautiful. And it just sort of fades out into infinity. Yeah, it gets me every single time. So if I'm going to pick a number one all time, it would have to be Appalachian Spring.
All right, Jim. So I asked this of composers. If there was one of your works that you would want someone to listen to first to understand your music, which of your works would you send them to?
That's an easy one. Ghost of the Old Year is the one that I feel like is really personal to me. It was written in 2016, and I finished it just a few weeks before my father actually passed away. He had cancer for a long time. So I was writing the whole piece while I knew this was something that was a possibility. And it really is kind of dedicated to him and to band music in general. I tried to find ways to incorporate so many different band pieces and ideas there. It also has sort of my relationship to Southern gospel music as well. It uses a shape note hymn is actually one of the main melodic ideas in the piece. And it's gotten some great performances recently. It was played at TMEA by the North Texas Wind Symphony, and they have a great YouTube video of it up there. And also there's they just came out with a commercial recording of it as well. So that's one that's pretty easy to find, and I think it really sums up a lot of my thoughts about music just in general. And again, it's a very personal sort of piece. So that would be a great one to start with. And With Soul Serene is the other one that I mentioned. You can find that one on my website. if you're looking for something that's more sort of in that grade 4 sort of territory and a little bit more accessible, shorter piece as well. So,
is there anything coming up that you'd like to share or promote?
Yes. I just completed my first symphony, which is for band. And it is going to be premiered at the end of February by the Florida State University Wind Orchestra. And it's also going to be at 2 of the CBDNA regionals, the Southeast Regional with the University of Alabama, and then also at the Northwestern Regional with Whitworth University. And I'm really, really excited about that. I just finished the piece, literally delivered it on January 1st. So I'm really, really excited about that new piece. And one other thing that's kind of a unique program that we have here at Colorado State, and this is kind of a chance for me to mention it, we have a Master's of Music Education degree with a composition emphasis. And I believe we're maybe the only program in the country that has such a specific title like that. But it's a degree program that's kind of 50-50 of composition and music education. It's designed for people that have a background in either field. So if you have a bachelor's degree in music composition or in education, you could apply for this program. And we really are emphasizing on how to write for educational ensembles, band, choir, and orchestra, K through 12 grade levels. We work specifically with the schools in Fort Collins and have music performed by students at those particular programs. And it's a really interesting brand new program. We just got final approval of the program in 2019. So we're just now starting to get our first students into that. So yeah, if people are interested in that and want sort of a different experience from a traditional master's degree in composition, that's another big thing there that I wanted to highlight.
Oh, that's cool. All right, Jim, how can people get in touch with you?
The best way would be through my website, jamesmdavid.com. And I have all of my music up there with scores and recordings. Of course, you can, find me on Facebook as well. And I can get back to you really quickly there also. So those are the best 2 places.
Excellent. Jim, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Mark. This is fantastic. I feel super honored to be a part of this. This has been such a great service that you're doing to the music community. I just can't express how much of a thrill it is to talk to you and to talk to your listeners about what I do as a musician. It's really an absolute pleasure.